So here we are on a sunny afternoon and chapter 19. Pedro, simple jacks and a handful of beans. It was not that Pedro thought we too recently, by potato standards, arrived Englishmen were stupid, but he did endorse us with more than a little naivety. And after all, business was business. Luis's brother Pedro liked Stephen and me. He counted himself and his wife amongst the first to befriend us two when we'd started buying firewood from him. And he admired the way that we two strangers had built a life and a place in Potato. Unlike other English people who had settled in his village over the years, and even though we were not one of the boys, we were undeniably much more a part of the community than others had been. We never failed to stop and exchange greetings with our neighbours, whether we were on foot or in our car. And we made a very conscious effort to learn the language and appreciated the smallest gestures of friendship, which we replied to with our own small gestures and genuine affection. See, all indicators pointed towards one conclusion, that Stephen and I were in Potato to stay. Something that was further emphasised when we had spoken to Pedro about the prospect of buying some land from his family. The Portuguese man's father had been an astute businessman at a time when, in the agricultural community, land ownership had been a mark of wealth and power. Over the years, Pedro's father had enlarged his portfolio to such an extent that when the reckoning was done following the old man's death, over 100 deeds were in the possession of his heirs. Unfortunately for his sons, by that time the Portuguese people had largely turned away from small holdings as a viable business plan, and the value of what they held had reduced substantially. Foreigners had been making the most of the situation for years, attracted by the space, a low cost of living, and for the Brits at least, a favourable exchange rate, all of which meant people from wealthier nations could retire abroad and enjoy some clement weather whilst living the life of landed gentry. Stephen and I were not in the ranks of those with pensions or estates. The house we had bought was modest and with a patch of land little different in size to that of a suburban garden back in England. It had been during our second year of living in Potato, at a time when a little money had still sat in our bank account, that we had approached Pedro and his brothers about the prospect of buying the field next to our house. It was not a very large piece of land, but that suited us too, because by that time we knew, from the stories and experience of expats, some of the pitfalls of being landowners. It was doubtless all very nice to look out across acres of your forest or fields, but what about keeping them clear of brambles and vegetation that could lead to forest fires, let alone the complications of irrigating crops in a field without water rights of some sort? No. At the time we had inquired about the land adjacent to our home, we were toying with the idea of planting fruit trees and eventually producing homemade peach wine. But due to a matter of strained relationships between the Portuguese brothers, the proposal was not seriously considered until the patriarch had passed away and the estate fully divided up. Time moves differently in small villages and amongst the retired. So even though a few years had passed since Steve and I had expressed our interest in buying the plot of land next to where we lived, Pedro, on becoming the owner of that said field, believed a great opportunity for him had presented itself. Supporting his belief that his English neighbours would jump at the chance to divert some European funds his way, was evidence of a positive change in our fortunes. In the place of our old Renault Clio, there was now a new, larger vehicle, and village gossip had it that we were to be the heirs of a large property in a nearby village, courtesy of an elderly family member who had moved to Portugal a year or so previously. So, quite accidentally, one Saturday afternoon, or at least that was what he wanted us to believe, Pedro just happened to bump into us by our home. The idea of staging a chance meeting had been discussed with his wife. Seeing no reason to play games with the two men who she'd considered friends, Ruth had disagreed with Pedro's strategy. But the Portuguese man had been taught his business acumen by his father and believed firmly that it was best to play it casually rather than appearing needy, which would give his negotiating partners the upper hand when agreeing upon a price. He knew that by appearing on the parcel of land next to where we lived, Melina could be relied upon to draw our attention to him. And as calculated, Melina's friendly, excited barks had brought Stephen and me to the low wall which divided our property from the surrounding segregated countryside. After the usual exchanges were made, boa tarde, tudo bem, etc., the Portuguese man went all out for dramatic. In a lowered voice, speaking in a manner that had tones of conspiracy about it and alluding to great opportunity for Stephen and me, he made us privy to the knowledge that he was now the official owner of the field in which he stood. A couple of minutes following this revelation, which Stephen and I had been told many weeks before by our friend Manuel T., we and Melina had vaulted the barrier between properties and were receiving a tour of the land for sale. Our guide pointed out that they were about where the boundaries ended, who owned adjacent plots, and after being questioned by Stephen, we knew that various rights pertaining to those who had access through the field in which we stood still applied. Pedro answered our questions, but generally gave little thought to the nuts and bolts of land ownership because the tightly woven patchwork of green and brown were a legacy of family ties which connected everybody in Potato to one of three families who had settled there a couple of centuries previously. And although there were lingering examples of rifts caused by land disputes, the passion that commodity had once arose had faded with the economic importance of it. No, it was not the day-to-day matters that Pedro wanted to talk about with us, and the direction in which he finally took the conversation as he tried to make Stephen and me understand and become aware of his idea was that he wanted to swap the piece of land with something he believed we had, or at least we could get. It took a while for the penny to drop, and even then it got stuck while falling. Both Stephen and I initially understood that the Portuguese neighbour had wanted to swap his field with some land belonging to our elderly friend, Eleanor, in a nearby village. The truth be told, I thought the proposal was worth considering, and as Pedro spoke, he gave encouraging smiles and comments to my supposed suggestions of what should happen. But Stephen was unsure about it from the start and gave no such gestures or encouraging words himself. Seeing the reticence in Stephen, Pedro played his trump card, showing us around the time-worn house which was part of the land deeds. He talked enthusiastically about how a new wall could be erected here, a new doorway there, and he believed, in his heart of hearts, that Stephen and I were very much capable and willing to do this fixing up of cosmetic flaws. It was around the time that Pedro was singing the praises of the ruin that I began doubting I'd understood the language as much as I thought I initially had. The Portuguese man seemed to be proposing a deal on the scale of Jack and his trade of a fatted cow for a handful of beans, but without the slightest doubt that there would be no goose laying golden eggs at the end of this tale. As the three of us walked around looking at adjacent tumbling ruins and discussing who owned them, I asked Pedro a few questions to clarify what I hoped was my misunderstanding, but I was disappointed to discover that I had not been mistaken by the Portuguese man's real intent after all. And Stephen shared my disillusion about that friendship. A couple of days followed the meeting between us three in that field. Stephen and I were knocking at our neighbour's front door, just as we had done years before when looking for someone to buy the firewood from. Pedro's wife had already made it clear to her husband that she wished not to hear the details of what, in her opinion, was her husband taking advantage of us two foreigners. And so instead of inviting Stephen and me in, as had happened in the past, when the door was opened, Pedro stepped out into the porchway, closing the door behind him. There was no frostiness on either side when Stephen and I politely turned Pedro's proposal down. What the Portuguese man had thought would be the start of a property negotiation was actually the explanation of why Stephen and I were in no position to discuss the exchange of our friend's property for his land and ruins. The vocabulary was amicable and apologetic, as, despite feelings of being a little miffed, Stephen and I were not particularly surprised by the turn of events. Pedro appeared equally benevolent by insisting that the decision did not mean that we could not buy the plot of land next to our house anyway. So, although I was someone who never forgot, even if I did my best, usually successfully, to forgive, Pedro's act did not go let me just read this last paragraph again because I'm making a bit of a mess up of this. So, okay, so back to the vocabulary was amicable and apologetic on mine and Stephen's part. Despite feeling a little miffed at being considered fools, we still tried to understand the reasons for it. Pedro appeared equally benevolent by insisting that the decision did not mean that we could not buy the land if we really wanted to. Yet I was someone who never forgot, even if I did my best, and usually successfully, to forgive. And in Pedro's act, I saw a sign that despite everything, Stephen and I were still considered as outsiders. Okay, that was the end of that part, and the end of part 4. Part 5 is closer to home. So, até a próxima.